All right, everyone, we are live. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. I have Representative Jim Hines from our great House of Representatives up in DC back at work this week, which is really exciting. Though you guys didn't really take too much of a break on the Democratic Party side. I know you guys have been in the office for a while, but we're going to leave those issues to the side for a second to talk about the 5th anniversary of January 6th, 2021. As I mentioned earlier in a video, a day that will live in infamy. Certainly one of those moments where you're watching the news and thinking like, this is not real though, right? Like, I think a lot of us were just having a moment. But Representative Himes, you were there. And I guess let's just dive right into what did you see? At what point were you like, this is not normal?
Yeah.
And all that kind of stuff. Just walk us through that.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you, it's a somber day because, you sort of think about what happened that day. I was actually one of the last people out of the chamber because it was during COVID, right? So the floor of the chamber where we were doing the meeting to, ratify the peaceful transfer of power, the floor got evacuated pretty quickly, but because of COVID, they'd spread members up into the gallery on the balcony overlooking the floor. And that got a little crazy because they slammed all the doors. But I'll tell you, to sort of start at the beginning, we were probably the last to know what was going on, right? Because we were in the chamber focused on what was happening. The Senate had just gone to the Senate. And so all of us are starting to get texts from our spouses and others saying, hey, are you okay? Are you okay? We're like, of course we're okay. No problem. But what we didn't see is the people scaling the walls and breaking the windows and beating up on cops. So in some ways, we were the last to know. But then, I realized that things had really gone south. I happened to be sitting just above the spot where the Capitol police officer fired his weapon and killed Ashley Babbitt when she went through the window to where the members were. That's when it was really clear that things were going south fast. And very quickly, I took a photograph of it because we're up in the gallery. There's about 12 members up there and a couple of very nervous police officers with their weapons drawn, pointing, by the way, at the door, that the president walks through to get to the State of the Union speech. And you can tell that door is being battered. And police officers have their weapons drawn, pointing out at these guys who were battering down that door, and where we were, officers with weapons drawn, actually pointing at their own guys. Because anyway, so it was mayhem, absolute mayhem. And fortunately, after 15 minutes or so, they figured out how to clear one of the doors where we were blockaded, and they got us to the same room where the rest of the members of the House were. We walked by all these, very heavily armed police officers in full tactical gear, holding a lot of these insurrectionists down, spread-eagled on the floor. And it was that hour or so was a really, really grim hour. Shocking. I mean, it's both, you worry for your own safety a little bit. I sort of thought to myself, worst case scenario, I'm going to take off this tie, mess up my hair, start screaming, and they'll think I'm one of the lunatics. And I thought, oh my God, what if I was AOC, right? They would draw me and quarter me on the spot, right? So I don't know, maybe that's what's called privilege, but believe me, it occurred to me. But what's really painful now is really one of the grossest moments in my lifetime anyway. And instead of dealing with it there's this massive effort to whitewash it. The White House has put up this obscene 1984 worthy whitewashing that these were patriots. And of course, we all know that in his first day of office, these are bad people. Let me tell you, I met them. These are bad people. And I hate to say it that bluntly, but these are people who listened to the most ethically challenged president we've ever had, just to put it nicely, tell a lie that we knew was a lie. And they decided that they would, assault 140 police officers. These are who these people are. And that they have been lifted up by Donald Trump and MAGA is just beyond disgusting. It's an atrocity. And, the only reason I'm not more angry than I am is because history tends to work these things out, right? Not a lot of people these days saying, yeah, Richard Nixon was a good guy, or Joe McCarthy was one of the good ones. So eventually history will sort this out. And the people who did this and the people who tried to whitewash it, they're going to have some answering to do to their kids and their grandkids.
Agreed. I think that, history and law and everything have a really they take maybe a bit longer to get to the point, but eventually, like you said, they work it out one way or another. I would say with kind of an asterisk, especially with history, if we do a good job documenting it, which is part of like you sitting down to interview with me today, which I really appreciate. Other creators like myself putting out content to be like, let's just be so for real about what happened. I was mentioning with you before we went live how I put out the story of, I believe, the only J6er who actually has owned up to what she did and what it was, which is Pamela Hemphill. And so you guys can go watch that video. It's in my notes. It's in my on my Instagram and TikTok and whatnot if you choose to do so. But certainly that is an example of, people can make mistakes, right? People can, and I mean by mistake, obviously I mean breaking the law and doing horrible things, but like you can choose bad things and there's still a way to eventually come back from it. She served her time. She came out, got help, and really has become an advocate for democracy. Not necessarily like the Democratic Party, though she has organized with them as well, but like democracy and the peaceful transfer of power and refusing the pardon, which was huge. I mean, there's not a whole lot of incentive to remain with a criminal record, but she chose to do so. Anyway, I would love to hear from you about what do you think this country, along those lines, what do you think this country needs to do as a whole to avoid this this thing that we've fallen into? J6 is one of the examples, but even just the reckless abandon of the rule of law for the last year that we have seen. It's not the first time in our history that we've been in sort of a lawless state, but it is obviously probably the one of the worst times in modern memory, or I'd say in most living memory. So, from your opinion, as a House rep and as a lover of democracy, like how do we protect this experiment that's been going for 250 years this year?
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a great question. It's one I've thought a lot about in the last 5 years and before that, because, well before January 6, 5 years ago, the American people decided to elect Donald Trump, right? And I'm like, how I love this country and I love her people, right? And like, how does that happen? And how does a guy who clearly lies, who is a broken human being, who exhibits behavior you wouldn't accept from a 3-year-old, how does he have a huge following in the United States? So I've struggled with that. So two thoughts for you. Number one, you can't lose faith, right? And this is why I made the historical example about how we recover from things like Joe McCarthy. I tell people, you got to know that we're not as good as you think we are, right? So when you're freaking out over the National Guard in DC, which you should freak out about, remember that we're not where we were in the early 70s when the Ohio National Guard killed several students at Kent State. We haven't seen that yet. So keep some historical perspective here. But then, and here's how I end every town hall meeting, and I've done this for years since Trump was around, because I do think things are a little different now with social media, which has be wildly abused, and the sort of destruction of traditional, old school newspapers, people trying to sort of pitch it down the middle. What I tell people is like, look, I've got some ideas, but we need to resurrect the notion that one of the biggest obligations that we have is being citizens of the United States. So that's a privilege. It's a privilege and it's an amazing thing. Like if God said to you as an embryo, you can be born at any time and place in human history, you would probably choose now in the United States because of the incredible bounty that we have and the liberty. But with that comes an immense amount of responsibility to actually do the damn work, right? To figure out what is honest, to figure out when somebody's manipulating you, whether it's Donald Trump or the Chinese or whoever it may be. And we've gotten away from this notion that citizenship involves obligations. And look, I close every town hall meeting by saying, I have some ideas, but if you guys decide that the difference between Republicans and Democrats is the difference between patriots and traitors, if you decide that violence is okay to achieve your political ends, if you decide that you don't want your kid marrying somebody of the opposite party, we're done. There's nothing I can do. We're done. So think seriously about the obligations that come with this enormous privilege of being U.S. citizens. I wish I could tell you how to make that happen,
Right.
but,
Oh,
but I
no,
know
don't
that that's
worry.
what needs to happen.
I spend so much time on my channel doing exactly that, talking to people about why we call representatives and what we say to them and how we, petition for what we want and what buttons to push as far as like regulation and rule of law and like all that kind of thing. So don't worry, I've got that part covered. But I agree. I think we could summarize what you just said. In democracy is a participation sport. It is not a it's not a spectator situation. Like, and I do believe that what we have right now, if you look at like the electoral data and everything, is a lack of participation. It's not that the majority of the United States wants this, even though that is definitely the mandate and whatever, the narrative that is pushed. But if you actually look at the numbers, we, the people of the United States, do not by and large want most of what's happening. And it is, but if your voice is not raised at the ballot box, if you don't organize for the candidates that you want, if you don't push the positions that you want to your electeds, if you don't communicate with
Yep.
your representatives, well, how the hell is that supposed to happen? So
Yep.
I think what you just said is exactly. Thank you. I did not script this, everybody. That was
Okay,
Representative
by the way,
Hines.
if I could add on to that, you and I are
Absolutely.
100% in agreement. But you know what I also encourage people to do? Because when we have these conversations, be like, well, we should teach civics in high school again. And I
Yes.
agree with that, but that doesn't seem like it meets the moment entirely. You know what thing is really important too? Run for something. Run for your
Yes.
local school board in your village of 2,000 people. Run for your finance board. Here's why I say that, right? And you don't need to run for Congress or Senate or governor or president. Run
Right.
for something local. Why? Because at the local level is where your life is affected most. And the act of actually participating on your local school board, now all of a sudden you need to realize how hard it is to balance the diverse interests that exist in this country. In a little town, you've got young parents of children who want to spend infinite amounts of money on the schools, and you've got retirees living on fixed income who can't pay a lot more taxes. And as an elected official on a school board, you need to figure that out. And I keep telling people, like, do it, because
Yeah.
you'll understand that the only way this works is if people listen, if they're willing to compromise, if they're willing to negotiate. And so I don't know if, 50% of the American public is ever going to run for school board, but people need to do that.
Right. No, I completely agree. And one thing that I've come across a couple of times in my work, and I'm sure you've heard this a million times, is like, people have like their red line issues or whatnot. And I do think that there are some issues that are red line, right? Like we should not incarcerate people without a trial. Like there's some basic rights and stuff. But then there's red line issues that are like, well, I will never raise taxes or I will never, and that's some of the rhetoric that we've heard from like the MAGA Tea Party the evolution ever since like Reagan or whatever. It's like when you do that black and white thing, that's when democracy becomes almost impossible. Because
Right.
in some cities, in some states, in some federal governments or whatever, some of those red lines are just not feasible in all situations at all times. You can't guarantee to a group of people, no, read my lips, no new taxes or whatever.
Yeah.
Eventually that's going to screw up, and then and then we end up in a mess where you made a promise that you couldn't keep because you weren't willing to just be real about what the democratic process actually is. So,
Exactly. No, I mean, look, signing pledges, which, every group tries to get everybody to sign pledges around here, by
right.
definition, that is being a terrible legislator, a
Yeah.
terrible representative, right? Because,
Right.
you don't answer to the Americans for Tax Reform or to whoever. You
Right.
answer to your constituents, right? All of them. Look, I represent a whole bunch of Republicans, and every single day I represent people. Look, I'm 100%, pro-choice on League of, you name it, Planned Parenthood. But I try to treat with respect people with whom I disagree. The
Right.
pro-life folks. There are a lot of devout Catholics and evangelicals who are, for deeply rooted faith reasons,
Right.
pro-life. And who the hell am I to say you're absolutely wrong and you're evil
Right.
for believing it? If that's the route we go, it's game over. It's game over.
Right.
We've got now. There's a line here, right? We have to
Right.
respect each other's difference, but there is a line, which is why I
Right.
gave you why I was pretty tough on the J6 people. No, you do not get to commit violence against police officers or
Right.
be a, latter day KKK guy looking at
Right.
you, Mr. Proud Boy, so there is
Mhm.
a line, but, on most of this stuff, we just need to be respectful of different views.
Well, and we can offer solutions. You brought up abortion. So there are solutions from the left liberal side that can actually achieve the same ends. Like, yeah, we actually get less abortions overall when we have access to sexual education and birth control and whatever. It's like, so we can actually solve the problem that you're looking for, because I don't think anybody walks around on any party or independent or whatever going like, I would love for us to have more abortions in this. You know what I mean? Like that's not really what
Right.
anyone's thinking. It's like, if your concern is that we don't want to have this be like the de facto contraception or de facto healthcare, cool. I think a lot of us can agree with that. But there's ways to go about it that aren't resulting in women bleeding out in parking lots in the hospital. So that's, anyway. I feel like we could speak for a long time, but Representative Himes, do you have any closing thoughts about, you know, how we commemorate this day, how we commemorate it moving forward? Anything else you want to say about preserving democracy and the rule of law and the peaceful transfer of power, and participating, as we were just talking about?
Yeah, we've covered a lot of really important ground there. Because the people who showed up here to commit violence, these are not people who are respectful of opposing points of view. These are not people who eschew violence in all situations. They're the opposite of that, right? So the question is, the conversation we just had is the conversation about how we prevent that from happening again. Now, what hasn't happened, we started here, what hasn't happened is an honest reckoning, right? And the good news is, I think you and I agree, it may take a little time, but particularly these days, right? I mean, if this had happened in 1952 with a bunch of guys with, cameras taking pictures, now, I mean, there's just thousands of hours of footage about what actually happened. So, you know, you can be pretty down on social media and its ability to promote mis and disinformation. But one thing it absolutely does is it records the facts, right? So, it's pretty darn hard for a Republican member of Congress who walked out of the chamber and, shook his fist in support of the insurrectionists, looking at you, Josh Hawley, to say, I didn't do
Mhm.
that because you're on film now. You
Right.
know?
Oh Lord, that's like a whole thing. But yeah, no, that is a perfect way, I think, to wrap it up. Is there any first of all, it's midterm year. Are you rerunning? Do you want to tell everybody about what your plans are for 2026 moving forward?
Yeah, well, I haven't officially announced, but I certainly haven't made any plans not to run. I'm tempted,
Okay.
I must say. Every once in a while, I am tempted, especially after a beautiful holiday break. Like so many people in this job, people are like, oh man, it's pretty nice when you get to do 2 or 3 weeks straight.
Right.
But no, let me tell you this. I've talked to a lot of my colleagues, many of whom were with me in the chamber on that day. And what I said to them, because, for some folks especially, it's bringing up a lot of PTSD
Mhm.
and I really do feel this. It's hard and it's ugly, but I feel so blessed to be called on to fight this fight. My parents were sort of 1960s hippies and stuff, and so the civil rights movement for me was always like this incredible thing that happened, and oh my God, what an amazing opportunity that was for young people in the 1960s. And we celebrate these people, and wow, this is our generation's turn to stand up for what's right and what's just. And so it's hard, but man, do I feel blessed to be able to be part of that fight.
Amazing. All right. Well, I'm doing a midterms candidate interview series. So if you make your decision and you want to come back, you are most certainly welcome. For everyone else viewing, I am Kate Powell with Kate for the People, Kate_for the People on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And obviously here on Substack. And I also have a Facebook. So you can find me basically anywhere. I do a bunch of content on pro democracy, pro rule of law, how we participate in the bureaucracy and the democracy to make sure that we don't lose it. And I also like to be really snarky with people who are against such principles. So, Representative Himes, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you this evening. I will let you get back to the rest of your day. You've been very generous with your time. And thank you for standing on truth and business when it comes to January 6th and anything else that threatens this thing that we love so much.
Thank
So,
you.
take
Thanks.
care.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks so much.
Of course. Bye bye.